Okay, so I'll move on to Sandra's question, if that's all right, Sandra. So Sandra, from what I understand of your approach on this topic, your understanding around this really comes from understanding the psychology of conquest. I wonder if you would mind telling us a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. So there's something that I'd like to do that is about responding to both what Shodo brought, particularly in your description, Shodo, of learning to live with plants that we have labeled weeds. And Kathy, what you just talked about in terms of what if the opposite of winning was not losing, but in a way living with, that would be another way of thinking about it. And I think it's fair to say that I do bring a slightly different task from becoming aware of these dynamics within ourselves. We can't do this dismantling of conquest without awareness. I'm completely in that territory as well. But I think that the way that I've had to look at this has been to try and really think about what are the origins of our need to conquest, our need to conquer. And I've been in a very long journey that is about examining myself, but also observing, very close observation of certain behaviors in society. And I've come to think about our drive to conquer as meeting some fundamental psychological needs. And so I really need to ask for forgiveness in what I'm about to say, but I do think that awareness actually may very well not be enough, because I think that there are some very valid needs that are being met through the drive to conquer. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes to try and bring out how I see that. And it's brought me to think about us human beings as a social creature. And what is it, you know, particularly in the West, we think about ourselves, and our whole story about ourselves is that we are individuals. And so that's where that proposition that winning and conquering is so positive, because that's in service to the individual getting what we need. And we've constructed this either or set of ideas that I can only get what I need if others, you know, by conquering others. But actually, what's at the heart of being a social creature? It seems to me that at the heart of being a social creature is a sense of what I'm going to call goodness. Now, I'm going to give you a warning. There are 3 words I'm going to use. All of them need much more unpacking than we've got time for today. But I hope that I'll be able to communicate something of the essence of them. So the first one is that we need to know ourselves as social creatures as having some essential goodness at the core of us. When we are social, we want to be of service to the whole. We don't only want to be of service to ourselves. For me, that's a really core idea in being a social creature, a social species. So I'm going to invite you to think about a triangle, and at the bottom of the triangle is that concept of ourselves as good. And then there are the 2 sides of the triangle that reach to different corners. I think when we think about ourselves, we also need to see ourselves as and know ourselves as valid. That each of our individual lives is valid. So the needs that we have as a specimen of the human species are valid. And so for me, this has been the most critical insight of what I've learned when I think about what happened to how the Nazis began to see Jews. Because what happened in that period of history is that within German people's eyes, Jews lost their validity. And those of us who have looked into this, it's been recorded so many times that the Jews began to be described in language that was subhuman. And most often they began to be described as vermin. And that is a way of stealing away the validity of what it means to be human. So I'm not even talking about dignity. I'm really talking about that core quality of my life is valid. I'm entitled to it. I'm entitled to breathe. I'm entitled to fulfill myself. I'm entitled to desire even to fulfill myself. I'm entitled to desire to live a good and healthy life and to contribute to the whole. So there's something very important about that. What would drive somebody to need to steal the validity of the other and take it to oneself? And then this is the more complicated word, the other side of the triangle is that I think we also need to know ourselves to feel that we're valid. There's a level of our consciousness that needs to know ourselves as innocent. And I mean that in a very particular way. And I'm drawing from the psychodynamic theories of psychology, so Freud and Jung, which Freud in particular focused on the origins of personality being shaped in our very young experience as babies. So that's one of my foundation stones. So if I think about innocence, I'm really talking about we are innocent, are valid, particularly when we're very young. And if we think about how our personalities get shaped, they get shaped by the interaction of our innate character with our environment. And so there's a level at which if our needs, our valid needs don't get met, how our personality then gets shaped in response to that, very young, there's a level at which we're also innocent of our response to that. We're doing our best to respond as well as we possibly can to the adversity that we're experiencing. And it seems to me that our core self-esteem, which is what enables us to function as healthy, strong, contributing members of our communities and our families and indeed our species, is rooted in having a core sense of ourselves as good, valid, and innocent. And if we can't experience ourselves as that, I think what is produced in us is a very core experience of ourselves as shameful. And I want to draw a distinction between shame and guilt. Shame is about who we are, guilt is about what we do. And if we feel that we have not been able to get our needs met, this is a very classical way of thinking about human development. If when we're very young, we haven't had a chance to get our needs met, our valid needs, of which we're innocent, because we're simply a creature, then I think what's created in the core sense of ourselves is an incredibly deep hole that is full of shame. And then that produces a set of behaviors that's about trying to fill that unfillable hole. And part of that is taking to ourselves everything good in the world. And part of that, therefore, becomes stealing the validity of everything else, because my hole that I'm struggling to fill to prove to myself that I'm valid is so deep. And there's a level at which if I can't experience myself as valid, I can't experience others as valid. And I can't want their needs to be met either. And somehow that it creates a kind of twin drive to prove my validity by stealing others' validity to fill my hole. And also at the same time, there's this sort of compensatory drive to kind of keep proving I'm innocent. But because I'm poorly resourced, I can only do it in the same way of trying to take everything good to myself. So that's one way I have of understanding why it's not as simple, I think, as saying I need to become aware of the ways in which I want to conquer. I think there are other things that we also need to do, which is about resourcing ourselves, expanding our sense of ourselves, and coming to know ourselves as good, innocent, and valid, so that we then aren't needing to compensate for anything. So then we're not still needing to kind of fill up something inside ourselves that is so deep and so needy. So for me, the first project is to expand our sense of goodness, innocence, and validity, resource ourselves, really, in a way, train ourselves to know that we are born with those qualities. They are our birthright. And then we can relax. We don't have to prove anything. We don't have to prove anything by grabbing to ourselves what doesn't belong to us, including others' lives, including others' well-being, including even other species' lives and well-being. We can then have a better chance of living in harmony with everything that there is. I've took longer than I planned, but I hope that that was coherent and offered something.
More than coherent. I feel like I just did an absolute masterclass. that was really, really amazing, Sandra. Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, I'm in complete awe of what you just said.
Let's put Sandra in charge of the world.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So that thank you, Kathy. Let me just say then the project. So I've obviously talked about it as an individual, and I've struggled with all of these things in my own life. But the project actually then becomes, how do we translate a set of understandings like that, a set of propositions like that, into a collective setting? And that's very much what I'm preoccupied with. And there's something, the last thing I'll say is that what I do want to participate in is that if I do understand that when I meet people who I find very challenging because they're involved in a mindset of conquest, the task I've set myself, and so this has really required me to expand myself, has been to share in the project of upholding actively my and their sense of being good, valid, and innocent. Really seeing that as a shared project, and really affirm that in powerful, active ways, to know that I am and equally they are. I mean, there was a book, I'm okay, you're okay. It's sort of in that territory, but really actively upholding that quality of innocence, particularly, is the most controversial one. And then there can be, I think, that relaxing. And then how do we multiply that up onto a collective setting? And a little later, I may be able to offer an example, an imperfect example, but it'll show how I was thinking about that. Anyway, I'm really shutting up now. Thank you.
No, it's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so rich. And I'm really hoping maybe in part 2, Sandra, we can explore a bit more of how we can fill up that cup of those needs. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Wow.